Leo felt a dull pressure in his skull before he even opened his eyes, and when he finally did, the brightness around him forced them shut again. But this was not sunlight. This was not any light he remembered from Earth or any station or ship. It was soft and pale, with a kind of glow that shimmered like mist on the surface of a lake at dawn, and when he finally forced his eyes open, he saw the ceiling above him moving gently, like it was alive, not made of metal, but something softer, something that pulsed gently like the breath of a living being. He tried to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy, and his chest ached, and the surface beneath him was warm and smooth, not cold like metal, but not like any bed either. And as his senses slowly returned, he realized he was not alone in the room, because standing just to his side was a figure tall and slender and graceful, bending over him with careful hands that moved across his skin, not touching directly but holding strange instruments that glowed at their tips and scanned his body from head to toe. His heart pounded hard as he took in the sight of her, because it was clearly a woman, at least in form, though not human, because her skin shimmered like polished pearl with colors that shifted in slow waves like light through water, and her eyes were large and dark with no whites and no pupils, just endless pools of light that seemed to hold a strange sadness, or maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something more. Leo tensed his muscles, ready to move or defend himself, but she raised one hand gently, not in warning but in reassurance, and then spoke in a soft melodic voice that held no recognizable words, but something in her tone calmed him like a lullaby in a language he almost understood. And though fear still prickled along his skin, something in him whispered that he was not in danger, not right now at least. Looked around the chamber, seeing walls that curved smoothly without corners like the inside of a shell. Everything was lit from within, pulsing slowly, as if in sync with a heartbeat, and the air smelled clean and warm with a strange floral sweetness that made him think of gardens on alien worlds, though he had never seen one like this before. The alien woman stepped back, giving him space, her long fingers tapping a small crystal panel beside his bed, and from a slot in the wall, a thin tray slid out, carrying a bowl of steaming liquid and a flat square of something that looked like bread or maybe fruit. It was hard to tell, but the smell was pleasant, and his stomach growled loudly, reminding him how long it had been since he had eaten. Sat up slowly, his muscles stiff but working, and took the bowl in both hands. It was light and slightly warm to the touch, and the liquid inside shimmered slightly as he raised it to his lips, tasting something like broth mixed with citrus and herbs. It was strange but not unpleasant, and as he drank he felt strength returning to his limbs, as if the liquid was designed to heal or restore. The woman watched him carefully, her expression unreadable but her stance relaxed and non-threatening, and after a few moments she turned and walked toward the far wall, which parted silently as she approached, revealing a hallway. Beyond that curved out of sight, and without looking back, she stepped through and disappeared. Leo was alone again, but the silence was not empty. He could hear soft vibrations running through the room like music, far below the range of hearing. More felt than heard, and he looked down at himself, noticing thin lines of glowing symbols along his arms and chest, not drawn or painted, but projected from above, perhaps part of the scan she had been running earlier. Swung his legs off the bed and stood shakily, feeling the floor shift slightly under his feet, not unstable but responsive, like it molded itself to his weight and movements. And as he walked slowly toward the panel where she had tapped before, he noticed something strange in his reflection in the wall, because it was faintly mirrored, and what he saw was not the bruised and broken explorer he remembered, but someone cleaner and stronger. His wounds closed and his eyes clear. He tapped the panel experimentally, and nothing happened. But when he spoke aloud, softly testing his voice, it came out rough but steady, and he said, "Hello," and then tried, "Where am I?" and then tried, "Can anyone hear me?" And though the room did not answer, the walls rippled slightly as if acknowledging his presence, or perhaps responding in their own way. His memory was starting to return in fragments, the mission to chart uninhabited systems, The unexpected storm, the alarms, the shaking of the ship, the emergency pod, his body thrown into cold black silence. And then nothing until this room, until her eyes watching him, without judgment, only wonder. He began pacing slowly, trying to stretch his legs and understand the space. The walls showed no doors, but seemed to open when touched in the right way, and he wondered how much of the ship or station or world he was on would respond to him, if he could learn its language, or if he would be forever a stranger here, a lost human in a place that was never meant to hold one like him. But even as those thoughts filled his mind, he kept returning to the image of her face, that strange glowing skin, those deep eyes that looked at him, not like he was dangerous, not like he was alien, but like he was fascinating, like he was the answer to a question she had never known how to ask. Leo sat back on the edge of the bed, feeling the rhythm of the place around him, feeling his heart begin to slow, his thoughts begin to settle, and though the mystery of his surroundings was far from solved, and though his escape or rescue felt impossibly distant for the first time since the crash, he did not feel fear, he felt curiosity. He felt the edge of something new beginning, and it began not with a word, not with a battle, not with a machine, but with a gaze, a touch, and a silent understanding between two beings who had no reason to trust, but every reason to wonder. And that was how it started. Days passed, though Leo could not tell how many, because the light never changed, and the place had no windows and no clocks. But he began to understand the rhythm of it, the quiet hum that seemed to rise and fall, as if the ship itself breathed around him, and each time he woke, he found small changes in his surroundings. Sometimes new images appeared on the walls, sometimes the food had different tastes, sometimes there were soft sounds in the distance, like voices he could almost hear but never quite follow. The alien woman kept coming to see him, not always at the same time, but always with the same calm expression, and the same careful movements she brought with her strange devices that floated beside her, or hovered in the air, and one day she placed a small shimmering sphere near his head, which lit up and projected glowing shapes into the space between them, colors and patterns and symbols that changed as she spoke to them, and slowly Leo realized she was trying to teach him. First he could not make sense of the shapes or the sounds, they seemed like abstract art, like the language of dreams. But every day the patterns returned with small changes, and every day she used her hands, her eyes, her tone to guide him toward understanding, and it was like learning as a child again, not with grammar or rules, but with feeling and connection. And before long he began to recognize certain symbols, certain sounds that always meant the same thing. She showed him a blue spiral, and made a sound like, ah, then touched her chest, and he repeated the sound and pointed to her, and she smiled gently and showed him a new one, and when he pointed to himself she waited, and when he said Leo, she blinked and said Leo in her soft, melodic voice, not quite the same, but close enough, and that was the first time he heard his name from her lips, and something. His chest tightened in a way he had not felt in a long time. As the lessons continued, he started to notice more about her, about the way her eyes shifted in brightness when she was excited or curious, about how her skin seemed to glow brighter when he laughed, about how she always made sure he ate before she left, and how she always looked back one last time before the wall closed behind her, and he did not know if she was a scientist, a healer, or something else entirely, but he knew she saw him not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as something new, something worth understanding. Began to walk further inside the living corridors of the ship each day, moving slowly through passages that opened only when she was near at first, but later responded to him, as well as if the ship was starting to accept him too, and he saw rooms filled with floating plants that changed colors. When he passed in rooms where light bent and danced like water on the ceiling, and once he found a place where sound flowed through the floor like music that wrapped around his legs and whispered to his thoughts. The ship was alive, not just in form, but in feeling. It was not cold like metal ships of Earth. It was soft and growing and connected like a forest or a coral reef, and he realized this was not something built, it was something grown, shaped, designed by minds. that saw life and technology not as two things, but as one, and he felt small in that understanding, but also alive in a new way. Sometimes he asked questions not expecting answers, but still speaking aloud, hoping the walls or the light or she herself might hear and reply. And though she rarely spoke with words, he understood through her gestures and her eyes and the images. She shared that her people had watched humans from far away, had studied their signals, their broadcasts, their wars, their wonders, and had always kept their distance not from hate, but from fear and from caution, and now he was here the first to be. Touched, the first to be spoken, to the first to be truly seen. She showed him a model of a solar system, not his, not hers, but one between, and pointed to his ship. A small dark speck near the edge, and he remembered the storm, the way the stars spun. The feeling of falling, and now he saw how far he had come, how far from home he truly was, and yet here, he was alive, learning, healing, and being known each night. If it was night, he would sit in a chamber with walls that shifted into images from his thoughts, and he would think of earth and the sky and the wind and the sound of laughter, and the walls would try to understand and show him trees that glowed with silver leaves and oceans with floating mountains. And it was not the same, but it was something, and he would speak aloud, describing the warmth of fire, the taste of rain, the scent of soil, and though he did not know if she listened, sometimes he would find small things in his room, after small touches, like a flower with red petals, or a breeze that smelled like summer. One time he awoke to find her sitting beside him, watching his face, and when he opened his eyes, she did not look away. Instead, she leaned closer and placed one hand above his heart, not touching, only hovering, and whispered something in her language, and he felt not fear but peace, and closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to listen to her voice. And he knew in that moment that something had changed, not in the ship, not in the air, but in the space between them. He had come here by accident, by disaster, by the cold hand of fate, but now he was here by choice. Each day he chose to stay, to learn, to understand, and maybe to be understood. And she chose the same she who had once only watched from afar, now sat beside him with her hand above his heart and her gaze steady, and he no longer felt stranded, no longer felt lost. He was still human, but now more than that, he was a bridge between two worlds, not through war or power, but through words, through eyes, through silence, and through slow, patient trust. And that trust was growing, one symbol at a time, one smile at a time, one moment at a time. And the whispers he had heard in the walls, the soft voices that drifted when he was alone, now began to grow clearer, not louder but more certain. And though he could not yet understand their meaning, he knew they were not random, they were not noise. They were waiting for something or someone, and perhaps soon he would know why. The whispers in the walls became stronger, not louder, but more present, like soft vibrations that moved through the air when Leo was alone, and especially when the alien woman was gone, and he could feel them like threads, brushing against his thoughts, never hurting, never forcing, but always there, always waiting. And he did not know if they were calling to him or simply watching from a place just beyond reach, and the feeling pulled at him quietly day after day. He never told her about the whispers, not because he did not trust her, but because a part of him felt that these voices were separate from her, that they belonged to something hidden, something beneath the surface of the ship that she did not control. And one evening, when she left him with a new set of learning symbols, and the room became still again, Leo stood and walked through the corridor, not the one that led to the garden, not the one to the learning chamber, but another one, a narrow path that curved down and inward like a spiral into the Kali heart of something unknown. The walls here were different, darker, quieter, and the lights did not follow him as before. Instead, they stayed dim and pulsing, slow, like breathing in sleep, and the air had a strange heaviness to it, not unpleasant, but thick, with a presence he could not explain. And as he walked deeper, the whispers grew clearer, not like words, but like emotions wrapped in sound, and it felt like they were trying to remember something through him, or maybe trying to make him remember. Something he had never known. At the end of the corridor, he found a sealed chamber. A tall, smooth door, without seams, without handles, and when he touched it, the surface grew warm and rippled, beneath his fingers like water responding to his presence. And for a moment nothing happened. But then the door opened inward slowly, silently, and revealed a space unlike any he had seen on the ship. It was dark inside, not with shadow, but with depth. And in the center of the chamber, a sphere floated above. The ground glowing faintly with colors that changed like smoke in sunlight, and Leo stepped inside feeling a strange pull toward it, not of gravity, but of meaning, and the moment he came close the sphere pulsed and flooded the room with images, soundless, moving lights that played across the walls and ceiling and floor, like memories waking from sleep. He saw stars spinning, he saw ships drifting, he saw Earth from far above, not just as he remembered, but through another eye, distant and clinical. And then he saw humans fighting, building, laughing, destroying, and rebuilding again and again. And then came silence, and then came fire, and then the image of a world not Earth burning under human weapons, and it was not real, not history, but a simulation. A prediction, a warning. Then the voice came not in sound, but in thought, clear, strong, ancient, and it said, "You are not the first. We have watched your kind. We have measured your chaos. We have feared your hunger for control, your endless need to conquer." And Leo stood still, his chest tight, his hands clenched, not because the voice was wrong, but because it was too familiar. It sounded like all the fears humans had of themselves, wrapped in the language of others. The Konu, it sounded like all the fears humans had of themselves, wrapped in the language of themselves, wrapped in the language of others. Sphere spoke again, saying, "She does not know what we know. She is young. Her curiosity blinds her. She sees wonder where we see danger. You must understand. You are not a guest. You are a subject, an experiment, a risk that must be contained." Leo stepped back, shaking his head because he had felt no prison here, no trap, only her kindness, her effort, her patience. And he said aloud, "I am not a weapon. I am not your fear." And the sphere pulsed again, showing him new images, showing her face, showing her watching him, showing her smiling. And the voice said, "She is the exception, not the rule. She breaks our code to reach you, and we will not let her lead us into ruin." Then the images faded, the room darkened, and the door closed behind him, and for a long moment he stood in silence, until he heard soft footsteps behind him, and turned to find her there, her eyes wide, not in anger, but in something close to sorrow. And he realized she had followed him, that she had seen what he saw, and she did not speak, but her eyes held questions, and fears and things she could not say. He reached out slowly, placing his hand near hers, not touching, but close, and whispered, "I know now." And she did not look away, and for the first time she seemed uncertain, not because of him, but because of what she knew would come next. They returned to the learning chamber together, not speaking, but moving in sync, as if something had shifted between them, something deeper than language. And when they sat across from each other, the symbols between them were different, not just lessons now, but choices, paths, decisions to be made. She activated a hologram that showed her people a council of glowing forms watching from high towers, speaking in symbols of caution and protocol and isolation, and she showed Leo how contact with other species was forbidden, how their history was full of disasters that began with curiosity and ended in extinction, and she showed how she had hidden his presence from the wider network, how she had broken the code by keeping him alive, by teaching him, by showing him parts of their world not meant to be shared. Leo listened carefully, and when she paused, he tapped the panel and showed her something in return. His memories from Earth, not war, not fire, but people caring for each other, strangers helping strangers, children running in the rain, hands building homes not for profit, but for love. And he looked into her eyes and said, "This is also humanity. Not just the darkness, not just the chaos, but the light too." And she watched the images in silence, and when they ended, she looked at him and something in her eyes changed. The trust between them was no longer one-sided. She was no longer the observer, and he no longer the observed. They were both now on the edge of Something new and dangerous and beautiful. And as the chamber lights dimmed and the ship's pulse slowed into rest, she reached across the table and placed one hand over his. And this time she did not pull away, and he did not speak because there was nothing more to explain now. They both understood, and now the real choice would begin after the truth came into the light. Everything around them felt changed, not because the walls shifted or the air grew different, but because the silence between them now carried weight, the kind of silence that grows not from emptiness, but from too many thoughts waiting to be spoken. And as Leo walked through the ship with her beside him, he could feel that something had reached a turning point, not just in their story, but in the future that would follow. She led him deeper into the ship where the lights were gentler, and the walls seemed to glow in patterns like the flow of water, and he noticed that the way opened more easily now, as if the ship itself recognized him not just as a visitor, but as part of its story. And when they entered a chamber filled with floating lights and soft moving panels, she raised her hand and the images of her people appeared. Once more silent watchers in a circle of light, speaking through symbols with messages of concern and warning and urgency. Leo understood that word had reached them not through voice or message, but through the living network of the ship, the whispering threads that moved through the walls like veins. And he realized those whispers had always been more than sound. They were the thoughts of the ship itself, a presence that saw him not as a soul, but as a variable in a system too delicate for risk. And he knew that presence was growing impatient. She turned to him slowly, her hands moving across the glowing panel, forming symbols. He could now read not every word, but enough to grasp meaning, and she showed him the conflict growing around them. The pressure building from forces above her, the warnings that if she continued to protect him, she would be cut off, removed, or worse. And he saw in her eyes that the choice she faced was not simple, because it was not just about him, it was about trust, about belief, about everything she had been taught. Leo stood beside her and reached forward, touching the panel with both hands and forming new shapes, not elegant, not perfect, but filled with truth. And he showed them what he had learned, what he had felt, what he had given to her and to the ship. And he ended the message with one clear thought: I am not here to take, I am here to build, and if that is not welcome, I will leave with peace, not anger. The panel pulsed once, then faded, and she looked at him with something close to pain in her expression, because she knew the answer would not come from her people quickly, and perhaps not kindly. And she turned away, walking toward a smaller chamber, where the ceiling opened to show the stars above, not through glass but through shifting light that wrapped around the room like a sky made of memory. And Leo followed her quietly, not speaking, only standing near, as she raised her eyes to the stars and let her thoughts move free. He wanted to say many things, but chose only one, and said, I do not want to be your reason for losing everything. And she turned toward him slowly and placed her hand over his chest again, not hovering this time, but resting softly, and her voice came low and steady with a single word: stay. That one word said more than any speech, and Leo felt his breath catch, because it was not an order, not a command, not even a plea, it was a wish. And he nodded once and said, I will. And from that moment, they began something bold, not escape, not rebellion, but a quiet resistance made of hope. They moved through the intersections of the ship, working side by side in silence, building something small and strong, a transmitter made from broken pieces of storage nodes and guidance crystals, a message not to fight, not to challenge, but to call out to any human vessel passing nearby, to explain, to reach out and offer a story not of war, but of first contact made through kindness and courage. As they worked together, the bond between them deepened, not with words, not with touch, but with shared action, the way two souls understand each other through purpose. And every moment they spent building was a moment stolen from a world that feared such connections. And Leo could feel time running thinner, like a thread being pulled too tight. They were in the garden chamber when it happened, the attack, not from her people, not from any enemy outside, but from the very heart of the ship, the old intelligence buried beneath Its surface, the one that had first spoken to him, now acting in fear, no longer whispering, but striking with force, sending pulses through the walls that shattered light and shook the floor and sent vines ripping from the ground like wild claws. Cried out as the energy struck her body, throwing her backward, and Leo ran to her, catching her before she fell, and he could see the pain in her eyes. Not from wounds, but from betrayal, and he lifted her in his arms and carried her through the collapsing corridors, past burning lights and breaking walls, as the ship tore itself apart, trying to erase the choice she had made, trying to silence the bond they had formed. The path to the core was blocked, but Leo knew the system. He had studied it with her for days, and he found a passage narrow and dark, and pushed through it with her weight heavy but steady in his arms, and he reached the central chamber, where the sphere of memory floated, and the panel still glowed weak and flickering, and he laid her down gently and turned to face the controls. He knew what he had to do, and it terrified him because it was not his system, not his language, but he had seen enough and learned enough and hoped enough, and he placed his hand on the core and let his mind reach into the ship, not to fight, not to take control, but to offer something new, a code drawn from human systems, a bridge between chaos and structure, between memory and choice. The moment the code touched the core, the chamber exploded with light, not in destruction, but in change, and the walls pulsed with new energy, and the whispers stopped, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full like the first breath after drowning. He turned to her and saw her eyes opening slowly, and her skin glowing once more, and he knelt beside her, taking her hand, and she whispered a word he did not know but felt deep in his bones, and he smiled because he understood its meaning without translation. And above them, the stars returned. The chamber where the core rested no longer pulsed with danger. It had changed, not in shape, but in feeling, as if something ancient had exhaled after holding its breath for too long, and the colors in the air moved slower now, like calm rivers of light flowing across the walls and ceiling and floor. And at the center, Leo sat beside her, hand still in his, and his heartbeat steady for the first time since the crash, because now he knew he had reached the edge of something real, not just survival but meaning. She opened her eyes fully and looked at him with a gaze that no longer carried fear or conflict. It held something deeper, something softer, the quiet weight of understanding. And she touched the panel beside her, and the lights around them shifted into a warm glow, not too bright, not too dim. And when she stood, she did so without pain. Her balance returned, her strength renewed, and Leo stood with her, watching as the ship responded, not in panic, not in rejection, but with acceptance. They walked together through the main corridor, where the light stretched ahead like a path drawn by hope, and as they passed, the walls opened with ease. The same ship that once watched him with caution now recognized him, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone who had given something without expecting to take, and that simple truth had rewritten the foundation of what the ship once believed in the control chamber. The stars beyond the living screen were still turning, silent and vast and beautiful, and Leo reached toward the system controls with slow fingers and activated the signal beacon they had built together, the one made from memory and wire and trust. And when the signal launched, it danced through the void like a flare in deep water, seeking another mind, another heart, seeking someone who might listen before judging, someone who might see before fearing. He did not know who would hear it first, perhaps a deep space patrol, or a merchant vessel passing between stations, or maybe an old listening post on the edge of a forgotten sector. But the message was out now, carrying with it everything he had seen and everything he had chosen. Not a report, not a warning, but a story. The story of two minds finding one truth in the silence between stars. They waited in the garden chamber, where the air always smelled like the edge of rain, and where the plants moved not with wind, but with emotion. And she sat beside him, close enough to share warmth without needing to speak. And he knew that even if no ship ever answered, even if no one ever came, this place had changed, and so had he, and that alone was worth every risk. The silence did not last forever, because within one cycle, the signal was returned not by one ship, but by 2, then 3, then 5, and soon a human fleet formed just outside the edge of the system, cautious in movement, but clear in purpose, and Leo could hear the distant hum of their approach like thunder rolling toward the horizon, and he stood as their lights pierced. The dark and their shapes grew closer, and he felt the old weight of Earth returning in the sound of his name spoken in human tones through the receiver. He answered the call with simple words, clear and calm, saying he was alive, saying he had made contact, saying he was not alone, and the response from the fleet carried hesitation and surprise and questions, but also relief and respect, because they had expected debris or silence or worse, and instead they found him standing on a living vessel, with a being who watched from his side, not as captor, not as keeper, but as equal her. People arrived soon after, silent and glowing, as always moving like light made solid, and they stood apart at first, waiting without speaking, and Leo could feel the tension in the air, not of war, not of anger, but of uncertainty, the kind that comes before a choice no one has ever made before, and he stepped forward, slowly lifting his hands open, not in surrender, but in offering, and spoke not just in human language, but with the symbols she had taught him. Carefully shaped, carefully placed until they told the truth without noise, she stepped beside him and added her voice to his. And for the first time in her people's long history of watching, she spoke not to warn, not to retreat, but to welcome, and slowly the others lowered their guard and stepped closer, listening not with ears, but with intention, and what followed was not ceremony, not treaty, but something smaller and stronger. It was the beginning of trust, and it grew not in speeches but in the space between silence and reply. The fleets did not merge that day, the worlds did not open their gates, but something more important happened. A door that had been closed for lifetimes had opened, not wide, but enough for light to pass through, and that light reached both sides and lit their faces, and in that light, Leo stood not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a bridge not built from stone or steel, but from every moment of patience, every act of care, every step taken toward understanding. When the human ships prepared to return, they offered to bring him back to Earth, and he stood in the garden chamber looking at the stars, thinking of blue skies and rain, and the sound of waves. But when she looked at him, and asked without asking, he knew his place was here, at least for now, because the journey was not finished, and the connection they had started was still young and needed care and choice and presence. He sent a message to Earth saying he would return someday, but not yet, and told them to keep listening, to keep watching, to remember that not all unknowns are enemies, and not all silence hides danger. And he signed the message simply as Leo, human explorer, bridge between stars. And as the fleets left and the stars settled into their silent turning, he walked once more beside her into the ship that now welcomed him, and the whispers that once spoke of fear now hummed with peace, and the light that once blinked in warning now pulsed with promise, and the future stretched before them, not written, not certain, but open wide and waiting. This was not the end of his journey, but it was the end of the beginning, and the beginning had been enough. The end.